Verstappen was clearly the best driver and not the best car to win in Canada. Hamilton at Ferrari is probably not that great for him personally, but it is for us. I have to be honest, I would like to see simple rules for Formula One. Simplified, a nice fat V8 with e-fuels, the end of the road. End of the...
Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin.com friends and Formula One fans to issue number 9 of our AvD Motorsport Magazine with Christian Danner. A warm welcome to you all.
Yes, hello everyone.
Yes, after Monaco you could say that we were well compensated in Montreal. That was a sensational race. How did you like it?
Yes, very great, of course, because we saw what had been predicted, namely that the field at the very front had moved closer together and that we shouldn't just assume that the same team would always win. Then the weather gods also played along, so it couldn't have gone much better.
Would you agree with me when I say that this time it was definitely the best driver who won and not necessarily the best car?
Yes, I would say it was the best driver. Everyone made mistakes, including him, but he made the fewest mistakes. And of course, there is always a little bit of luck involved in such conditions. But the pros and cons always balanced each other out a little. So I have to clearly say that yes, the best rider won and deserved to win. And you can see from Perez how much of a difference the driver makes.
It's been a crazy season. 2 weeks ago in Monaco, Ferrari still won the thing. It looked like the dominant car there. Then we came to Montreal and everyone said, yes, the track suits Ferrari again. Curb riding, very decisive. And Ferrari was the only top team that was virtually unrepresented up front. It was a catastrophic race weekend for the Scuderia, and it started in qualifying or perhaps even in the third free practice session. The pace just wasn't there. How can you explain that?
Well, I would like to come back to Monaco because I would obviously like to mention the difference between the two circuits a little bit. In Monaco, it is indeed the case that the driver can do an incredible amount. Yes, curb riding and so on is always important, but in Monaco you can really make time with. You can really make time. You can get further forward, even if the car isn't quite perfect. Not quite. So of course it's always difficult with a complete package. In Canada, things look a bit different, and especially so because it's not just about how you get the car through the chicanes, but also about the basic setup. How much downforce do I give the thing? So that I can still brake on the one side and get around the corners. On the other hand, keep the drag low on these very long straights. And that's why it's so problematic on such straights, because the air resistance is, let's say, the acceleration, and is of course also like a parachute at the top if I have a bit too much wing. And that's always been the case. That's nothing new. But finding the right compromise in the weather conditions is of course difficult, because rain means I'd like a bit of wing. I don't care about drag, but downforce is very important. And in the dry, it's a different story again. And I think Ferrari made a bit of a mistake there too, I would say. And then, of course, there were a few other problems with Leclerc in particular.
The magic word here is aerodynamic efficiency, which is completely irrelevant in Monaco. Do you think that was the case in Montreal? Just make a mistake, or is that a general problem with the Ferrari?
Well, I think they probably made a bit of a mistake, because it was already clear that Ferrari has a good all-round car, which is great in terms of drivability and which has good handling. Yes, I'm going to say the handling is so good that you can get along quite well with it everywhere. Personally, I rated and assessed the McLaren better even here in our conversation, but you shouldn't normally be as far off as Ferrari was in Montreal. They made a bit of a mistake there.
But that shows who the expert is. We had Ferrari a bit more on our radar before the weekend. We bow down to you and of course recognize that. But back to Ferrari at this point. Do you expect them to bounce back in Barcelona? Was that a one-off slip-up?
Yes, I think it was a one-off slip-up. Barcelona, I think, will be a very clear battle between Verstappen and the two McLaren cars. And to what extent Mercedes had to do with a one-off, had to do with a flash in the pan in Canada, is always difficult to predict given Mercedes' ups and downs. But I think we will reliably see Verstappen against McLaren in Barcelona. McLaren and the rest is probably like that. Yes, I'll say it, but not seriously enough. Like Norris and Piastri were both in Canada and were also in Monaco and so on.
The performance was only part of the Ferrari problem this weekend. Then there were strategic issues that we can talk about. In qualifying, perhaps we should have used the fresh set at the end of Q2 and then we might have got further. In the race, we all saw that they gambled a bit with the slicks and the poker didn't work out. Now, Ferrari looked a bit more stable under Fred Vasseur. Are they getting back to their old ways?
As far as training is concerned, I have to be honest and say that it happens in the best families. I wouldn't put too much weight on that. As for the slicks in the race, that was obviously a pretty adventurous move. But let's be honest, where you were driving around with the problems you had, you could gamble and say, okay, I'll just give it a go now. If it doesn't work, it doesn't really matter. In my opinion, Leclerc's slicks in the race shouldn't be judged as now it's going back to the way it was before, but that was due to the situation, and the situation tended to be hopeless, to put it mildly. You just try something that's not so conventional.
You said that the best families come before you. The same probably applies to the engine problems. Verstappen also struggles with it, but not in the race, but on Friday. Happens, doesn't it?
Well, of course, we have the complexity of a Formula One engine, or the different engines that are at work in a Formula One powertrain. It's terribly complicated. And with Verstappen, we saw that there's something about the battery, the energy recovery system, if I have to put it that way. I'm a fan of simple things, and a current power unit is certainly not one of them. And that can simply happen because the chances of one object in this overall system not communicating properly with the other are high. So be it an electric motor or a generator or a battery or a control element, that immediately leads to a major problem. From that point of view, it's amazing that so few things break down, but it affects everyone. It's already happened at Mercedes this year, and I don't think Renault is even talking about it anymore. And that's why it's just like this. It's still a lot better than when I was here when the engines were flying. Yes, so more or less 1 or 2 engine failures at the weekend were quite normal. Thank goodness we're out of those times.
It no longer looks quite so spectacular for us spectators, but let's leave the Ferrari topic for today and move on to your favorite section, Ask AvD. You ask the questions, not me. Today we've received some exciting questions from you again in the Ask AvD section, and Christian has already touched on it a little earlier. It's about Mercedes. The first question comes from JKZLXU, however you want to pronounce it. The question is, Mercedes showed a great performance this weekend. Do you think Mercedes is back? And if so, did Hamilton make a gamble by switching to Ferrari? Maybe we haven't quite finished with Ferrari after all.
Yes, it's coming. So let's start with Mercedes, dear ZLKU1 or whoever. Of course, that's a question I'm asking myself, which is why I think it's a very good question. Is this just another small interim high where we've seen that, yes, it's working now? And above all, that's why I'm so skeptical, because in the past, over the years, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen this again and again. All of a sudden, Mercedes was really good again. And all of a sudden, you thought, now it's the zero side pod principle. Russell wins and everything is great. That was a shot in the arm. Then you were really bad again. Then suddenly you were hopeful again. Now you were definitely very good in Canada. Is that sustainable? I don't know. I'm still a bit skeptical because the stories we've heard, what have they done? Yes, we changed the aerodynamics, changed the underbody. Of course, logically, that's the secret of performance. Nowadays, it's almost all about the underbody. But now it's something that worked in Montreal and not elsewhere. So I don't think we'll really know where we stand with Mercedes until Barcelona.
Can I pin you down on something? What would you put your money on? What would you put your money on? Is Mercedes back? Yes or no?
So James Allison has said you're looking through now. Since I think a lot of James Allison, because he's a very intelligent, very, very good chief engineer, I'll be the normal Christian optimist and say you're back.
Okay, I'm curious. I have absolutely no idea because we've really heard this too often in the last 2.5 years. That's exactly the issue.
That's exactly the issue.
The second part of the question was whether Hamilton had gambled with his switch to Ferrari.
Well, that's what I was wondering from the start, whether it was such a smart move, because he's still untouched at Mercedes, even with a very strong Russell. He is just the Lewis who is loved and who gets what he needs and who is heard and listened to every minute. It's a bit different with Ferrari. I'm very sure of that, Fred Vassar or no Fred Vassar. I was skeptical as to whether this was the right move. I think the bottom line is that it's still all right, and it's about a change of scenery. Sometimes a change of scenery is simply necessary. Sebastian Vettel has experienced that. It's something that a driver who has driven for a team for many years and has been very successful has to be allowed to do, is to be conceded. And that's why, let me put it this way, I'm personally very pleased that he's driving for Ferrari because it naturally complements the Ferrari theme in a way, rounds it off and perhaps makes it a little more peppery and exciting than it already is. So I see that as positive. And whether this will be his breakthrough to become a winner again, that may or may not be the case.
In that case, let's hope that the retapering ends a little better for Lewis Hamilton than it did for Sebastian Vettel, who almost had to tear down the walls afterwards. We have another question in our AskAvD section, also about the Mercedes complex. This time the username is a bit simpler. ASKAvD, apparently a BMW fan, if I may interpret it that way. ASKAvD wants to know, can Mercedes afford to go into the next season with George Russell as number one? He's strong in qualifying, but in the race he keeps making mistakes or is sometimes too impetuous. Do you think he can still learn like Max Verstappen, who is now a bit more level-headed?
So Dear X-Science has, of course, asked a very good question because the thing that annoyed George, most annoyed George in Canada, was that he had to be annoyed with himself. Because he clearly saw that he had made a huge mess of it himself. He actually threw it away. There was more in it. And I do believe that our questioner has made the right comparison with Max Verstappen. Because people who are intelligent, who are open to developing themselves further, like Max Verstappen, we have an advantage. And that's also how I rate George Russell as well. Yes, he's been a bit impetuous. He makes too many mistakes. But there's still room for improvement in terms of learning potential. I would say that what he needs now is a certain amount of composure. And then comes what we've already seen with Verstappen, namely flawless, error-free Grand Prix driving. Russell isn't there yet. Perhaps he is a little too impatient, but that's why there are people you can talk to about it. And if it's Toto Wolff, Toto said, I know my George. Of course, they live next door to each other in Monaco. They don't just see each other at the racetrack. And of course, he knows him from a long time ago. And he said he always interferes in the radio. He once had a comment in between, focus, George, focus, concentrate, George. He said that because he realized that he was getting a bit hippie and fidgety again. Now I have to intervene. And I think if you build on that, then Russell has the opportunity to develop further. I think he'll get over it.
Now you've praised our questioners twice. Now it's back to our questions, i.e. fishing for compliments.
I praise you too. I praise you too.
Let's move away from the Canadian Grand Prix and look at something that dominated Thursday but was also a big topic throughout the weekend, namely the rules for 2026. And we've already talked a bit about that when it was foreseeable what was going to happen. What was your first impression of what the FIA presented to us?
I wasn't surprised. I was already expecting something like that. But it's quite simple. Formula One only has a future if viewers can understand what they are being presented with. If they can consume it without always having to look it up on Google, what do they actually mean?
But Christian, you don't need Google, you have Motorsport-Magazin.
Yes, or even better in Motorsport-Magazin, but I don't know if you're commenting on the regulations in a well-timed way now. But look, joking aside, simplified should mean simpler. What the fan wants to see is not a exorbitantly complicated construction consisting of an electric motor and a detuned combustion engine. The combustion engine has been made worse than it can be, just so that it somehow fits, because that's how you would like it to be. So whoever is responsible for this, I read that it is Audi. I can't imagine that they would want such a nonsense. But what we are seeing is a car that, from the powertrain, is problematic. Let's just put it this way. In terms of aerodynamics, it's going in the same direction that Ross Brawn has already taken. However, again, you don't want an outwash and whatnot. You'd like to have the underbody in such a way that it doesn't work quite as well, but still works a little, and nothing comes out the back except clean air. So it's all very deliberate. And that's why I have my reservations that all the streamlining measures, sometimes smaller tires, sometimes more flexible aerodynamics, because the engine is like this now. I don't want to be so negative, but the engine is so complicated now that we can't just run it at full load. We'd run out of energy. So what do we do? Think. So we do aerodynamics, mobile aerodynamics. That's not enough. We also need smaller tires. I think something simpler would be better for everyone involved. It's too late now. The regulations are in place in whatever form. It will be waved through. Personally, I would like to see it. Stefano Domenicali gets his wish by saying, watch out, what's the point? We drive e-fuels, so we are CO2 neutral. We'll put a nice engine in it, a small 8-cylinder or something like that. And that's it. It also pushes, and we're also CO2 neutral. That's Domenicali's wish. And I'd like a little bit of that too.
I don't think you two are alone in that. Christian Horner also said some time ago that you have to be careful not to create a Frankenstein's monster on the chassis side because of the engine issue. Would you simply agree and say that the power unit rule has always been such a big egg in the nest that everything else is simply a consequence of it and you're trying to save it somehow?
Yes. So I don't want to confirm that in Horner there. Confirm the Horner quote, because a Christian Horner, of course, has his own reasons and his own agenda as to why he says or doesn't say everything. Personally, I'm just joining in because what I've seen now, this fiddling around and then we do this here, because otherwise that there and so on, I don't like that. It's not simple enough. And I love motorsport because you drive at full throttle from start to finish as best you can. And the more complicated it gets, the more complicated it is to get it across to the fans. That is and remains my opinion.
Now, the team bosses and drivers have made relatively dramatic statements. They doubt that this will remain the premier class of motorsport and so on. Do you share these fears, or do you believe that in the end it will be Formula One that will manage and it will remain the premier class of motorsport?
Yes, of course it will remain the premier class. I remember sitting in the motorhome with Bernie Ecclestone, and he explained to me that when GP2, i.e. Formula 2, was racing, look, Christian, you can't tell the difference to the Formula One. And when you look at them, well, they were fast and they made a lot of noise. Then he says, yes, but do you know how much a Formula 2 costs? It costs $1 million or whatever per car per season. And Formula One, they cost 100 times that. And that's why he said that's what it costs. For the spectator, it's not so relevant how fast a car is because you can't see it. When you're sitting in it, you naturally want a fast car because it's simply more exciting. It is and always will be the same. The faster a racing car is, the more fun it is to drive. The fact that I don't believe that the 26 cars now presented are particularly slow. What we're seeing at the moment, of course, is that battery and combustion engine handling are on the same level, that this is very, very difficult to achieve in terms of the energy balance. And that, of course, creates operational issues.
That was a look into the future. In our AvD Pit Stop, we're now going to take a wide berth and take a look at the relatively distant past.
"125 years of the Automobile Club of Germany. It's hard to believe that you've really been around for so long. 125 years that are really worth looking back on in detail." "1899, the foundation in Berlin. Back then the car was still in its infancy, just like you. You accept the challenge and continue to reach new milestones. You organized your first racing event, the Gordon Bennett Cup, back in 1904. In the same year, you introduced the first traffic regulations. You introduced the certificate of approval. Later, this is called a driver's license. You make German motorsport history. Almost 100 years ago, you organized the German Grand Prix at the AWS in Berlin. The nation's legendary racetracks inseparable from your name. You are up close and personal when the Formula One heroes make history on the Nürburgring Nordschleife. The 50s. The pretzel beetle rolls off the production line. Chancellor Adenauer is a guest at the AvD Pavilion, and you make your mark in terms of road safety. You establish crosswalks on German roads, and so you lay the foundations for safe mobility. The era of your roadside assistance begins in 1954. Over the decades, you optimize it to the maximum until today. Your premium package is then extended to include repatriation. Service, now your trademark. Since the 70s, you have also been organizing the German Grand Prix at the Hockenheimring. Moments that will forever be associated with you. You also promote national motorsport. You accompany the DTM into a new era for the GT3 era. Oldtimer Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, a paradise for fans of historic racing cars. On your AvD Histo Tour, the journey through the Eifel and Ardennen has been a legendary event for years. You are also aware that many things will change in the future, not just the cars. You are getting ready for the challenges that lie ahead. You, the Automobile Club of Germany, have been setting standards for 125 years. You will continue to do so because your journey is far from over. Yes, of course, it was nice to look back on it. I enjoyed it because motorsport is one of the sports that has grown with its own history, and we also did it at the Low Collection. It's a fantastic museum with incredible exhibits. Yes, it was a bit like walking around in a tuxedo all day. It's not really my thing, but it works. As long as it's about motorsport, no problem.
Suit, whether it's a racing suit or one of those
Exactly.
suits, in the end, it doesn't matter as long as cars are somehow involved. I don't know about you. I must say I had goosebumps when I saw those spectacular pictures. And then your lovely comment on it. I really enjoyed this interlude alone. I think you also survived and enjoyed the celebrations wonderfully.
Yes, they were in Berlin. It's not exactly my favorite city, but since I have a lot of friends there, yes, no, I think Berlin is great, but I got to know Berlin when I used to go there on the Abus race and always come home with a pile of scrap metal. That's why my initial feeling of well-being in Berlin was mediocre. But of course it's nice to do and celebrate in the place where the AvD was founded. And that's why I found Berlin absolutely fitting in the end.
From your not absolute favorite city, we'll move on to my not so favorite city in 2 weeks. Barcelona also has a bit of a personal past. You may know that the media parking lot is not the safest place in Formula One, but we won't be talking about that in the next issue. We'll be talking about hopefully sensational racing again. Barcelona, a bit dangerous for sensational racing, I would almost say.
Yes, it's a very strategic affair there. Overtaking is still incredibly difficult. And I think it's going to be a procession of speed. But despite all that, we will have the normal strategy elements in there again. And it's also nice to wait and see what we suspected a bit at the beginning of this show, how it might turn out. Will it really be like that? And we have Formula 3 and Formula 2 again, which I always like anyway.
That's a nice way to end this issue. Now we are looking forward all the more to the Spanish Grand Prix in 2 weeks' time. Of course, there will also be a follow-up report with Christian Danner in the AvD Motorsport-Magazin in the same place.
Whatever the topic, if you still have a question or two for me, please use the hashtag AskAvD.